know, these people don't even believe in our country. They're ashamed of our flag, ashamed of our nation, desperate to change it in any way they can.
I've never heard more nonsense in the whole of my life. The last Conservative government was the least populist government I think I've ever seen in the whole of my life. But he's perfectly clear that the reason for the riots is your fault. It's all your fault.
To get real. Because I tell you what you've seen on the streets of Hartlepool, of London, of Southport is nothing to what could happen over the course of the next few weeks.
Priti Patel, you're wrong on this. Keir Starmer, you're wrong on this. Most of us think that ethnic minority groups are policed entirely differently to that of white British people. Folks, that is what the country feels, that is what the country thinks, and there is evidence to back it up.
Nigel Farage has become the Grim Reaper, knocking on the door of Keir Starmer and his government. And let's be honest, under the leadership of Sir Keir Starmer, there's been no shortage of material for him to work with, from immigration blunders to the mishandling of public safety, like the Notting Hill Carnival. The Starmer government's failures are as obvious as they are numerous. And let's just say Farage has taken no prisoners in his quest to expose what he sees as the Labour Party's failings. Is Nigel Farage on the warpath against the UK government? And more importantly, what secrets does he know that we don't? As Farage's barbed rhetoric continues to make waves, the aftermath is the concerning truth about the UK government. Perhaps the worst of all is the immigration issue and the horrible policies surrounding it. Here's what Nigel Farage had to say on it.
Rwanda was never going to work. What Keir Starmer is proposing, which is to, tackle the gangs, well, frankly, the last government were doing that for the last few years. It's not going to work. At the minute, it's wild and windy, but we do have some pretty strong first-hand accounts that as soon as we get a calm spell, they'll be crossing the English Channel in their thousands. And let's face it, Keir Starmer does not have a plan to deal with it.
Illegal immigration, an issue that has not only crippled Britain's different sectors, but has also exposed the Starmer government's astonishing incompetence. Since taking office, Starmer has scrapped the Conservatives' Rwanda plan, a plan that Nigel Farage also opposed as desperate and too soft. And what was the result of this so-called humane approach? The numbers speak for themselves. Over 20,000 migrants have crossed the Channel this year alone, with a staggering 3,530 arriving in August. Yes, that's right, August, the height of summer, when the English Channel is as calm as a cup of tea.
And Starmer himself, standing outside Number 10, he's just become the Prime Minister, he's been to see the King, seems to be so lacking himself in his own policies, perhaps in his own abilities, that during a 9-minute speech to the nation, he looked down at his notes 150 times.
Farage has been quick to point out the utter failure of Starmer's immigration policies. The Prime Minister's response: a vague promise of cracking down on people smuggling gangs. But let's be real, when was the last time a smuggler in Calais trembled at the thought of a joint operation between London and Berlin? The truth is, the smuggling business is thriving, with dinghies packed fuller than a London tube during rush hour. We're talking 61 migrants per boat, folks. And yet Starmer continues to parrot the line that they're going to smash the gangs and strengthen border patrol, but there's no sign of any of that happening. No deadlines, no progress, only promises.
Wow, these are numbers the likes of which we've never, ever seen. The country is, many parts of it are becoming literally unrecognizable from what they were 10, 20 years ago. Managed migration and the building of an integrated society where we share things in common, like a language, like an education, like a loyalty, a sense of history, all of that can work. But when you subsume the population with vast numbers of people from different cultures, don't be surprised that they all stick together and actually, far from integrating, develop utterly separate communities.
It's not just the illegal immigration that's the problem here. Legal immigration is just as concerning. Firstly, there's nothing wrong with it as long as the immigrants integrate into British society. But that couldn't be further away from the reality of the matter. In fact, as Farage pointed out, a vast number of these immigrants have created subdivisions and continued to enforce their ideologies. Despite all this, the government has turned the other cheek, time and time again. What are the consequences? Riots. The ones we've been seeing recently.
Has misread this completely and utterly. Just to call out the actions of the far right is to misunderstand two things. Firstly, let's be clear, there were masked Muslim extremist mobs, some with weapons, going around the streets of Midlands and northern cities, threatening journalists literally running away.
The reality is stark unless the UK starts refusing entry to illegal migrants and, more importantly, removing them from the country. This crisis will only escalate. As the former head of UK Border Force warned, the only thing currently deterring these crossings is bad weather. Perhaps Starmer is hoping for an endless British summer to solve the problem. Unfortunately, that's about as likely as the Prime Minister taking a firm stance on anything.
What about the 61 police officers that were assaulted over the weekend at the Notting Hill Carnival? That's nothing to say of many of the other things that went wrong during that so-called festival. And I just wonder, I want you to answer this question for me, is this two-tier policing from two-tier Keir?
Moving on to public safety, or rather the lack thereof under Starmer's watch. The recent Notting Hill Carnival, a supposedly vibrant celebration of culture, was marred by violence. 8 people became victims of knife crime, 50 police officers injured, and 334 arrests later. And what do we get from Starmer? Crickets. Nigel Farage wasted no time in calling out this double standard. Will Keir Starmer condemn the 37 assaults on emergency workers at Notting Hill Carnival, he asked, pointing to the silence from Labour leaders. This isn't just about a few isolated incidents, it's about the systemic failure of the Starmer government to maintain law and order. When violence erupts, as it did at the carnival, the response should be swift and decisive. Instead, we get virtue signalling about cultural significance and community engagement. Meanwhile, the police are left to pick up the pieces literally.
Mike, Notting Hill is every single year, it's contentious. But there were more stabbings this year than last year, more arrests this year than last year, more assaults on police officers this year than last year, more sexual offences committed this year than last year.
The numbers here are as damning as they are shocking. The Metropolitan Police deployed over 7,000 officers to the event, costing the taxpayer more than PS11 million. That's PS11 million for what essentially turned into a war zone in the heart of London. And let's not forget the 67 weapons seized, including 2 firearms. The police report read like something out of a GTA game, and yet the Mayor of London and the Labour Party remain conspicuously quiet. It's almost as if there's one rule for the Notting Hill Carnival and another for everyone else. As Alex Wilson, a London Assembly member, rightly pointed out, recurring violence at Notting Hill Carnival must prompt a discussion on public safety and the policing strategies required for such a large-scale public event going forward. But under Starmer's leadership, don't hold your breath for that conversation to happen anytime soon.
I've never heard more nonsense in the whole of my life. The last Conservative government was the least populist government I think I've ever seen in the whole of my life. But he's perfectly clear that the reason for the riots is your fault. It's all your fault. It is society's fault. Nothing to do with government policy whatsoever. But moving on, this is the man who is going to be tough on crime.
The violence at Notting Hill Carnival is just one example of a broader trend under Starmer's government, a rising tide of crime that has left communities across the UK feeling unsafe and abandoned. Since Starmer took office, knife crime has continued to surge. And what's the government's response? More talk, less action. Farage has repeatedly hammered home the point that Starmer is failing to protect British citizens. Throughout Europe, governments are shutting down gangs and sending back illegal immigrants. But here in the UK, we seem to be doing the opposite, welcoming in more migrants while our prison system crumbles under the weight of overcrowding and underfunding.
That I won't tolerate a breakdown in law and order under any circumstances.
Really? Is that right? Is that why 147,000 people in the last year have been given community resolutions, which means nothing will appear on their police records? That includes offences such as violence and possession of weapons such as knives. Oh, and by the way, if you want to go shoplifting, that's absolutely fine. Unless you nick 200 quid's worth, we won't even bother to have a look.
The overcrowding in prisons is not just a logistical issue, but a matter of public safety. When criminals are released early due to lack of space, or when violent offenders are given lenient sentences, The message is clear: the government cannot protect you. And that, more than anything, is the ultimate failure of any administration. Farage has also pointed out the absurdity of the situation where resources are stretched so thin that the only deterrent left for criminals and illegal migrants is quite literally the weather. These figures show that the Calais smuggling business model is still thriving, and our best deterrent is still bad weather in the English Channel. It's a sorry state of affairs when the British government is relying on Mother Nature to do the job it's supposed to be doing.
But I'm worried, not just about the events in Southport, but about societal decline that is happening in our country. Law and order, folks, on our streets is breaking down. This Prime Minister hasn't got an earthly clue how to deal with it. We need to start getting tough. We need to use stop and search, regardless of the colour of the skin of anyone that gets stopped. We need tougher prison sentences for anybody carrying a knife. We need folks to get real.
The soft stance on violence and crime, especially from Starmer, is worrisome. Not only that, as Farage pointed out, Starmer has no clue how to deal with it. His policies are either out of touch with reality or simply ineffective. Even Starmer's policy regarding immigration is troubling, to say the least. Despite promises to respect the will of the people, his government has been quietly working to undermine the Brexit process at every turn. The new Border Security Command is seeking help from European countries. Whether it's through pushing for closer ties with the EU or dragging their feet on trade deals, it's clear that Starmer is undermining British sentiment. As Farage said, what we're heading for is a full Brino Brexit in name only. And that is disappointing in the extreme.
And if we don't take tough action across the board, we won't be able to fix the foundations of the country as we need. I didn't want to means test the winter fuel payment, but it was a choice that we had to make. A choice to protect the most vulnerable pensioners while doing what is necessary to repair the public finances.
When we look at Starmer's broader policy platform, the pattern of failure becomes even more evident. Take his approach to the economy, for example. Under his leadership, the UK's national debt has continued to balloon, now sitting at a staggering PS2.2 trillion. Granted that Starmer was recently elected, still the lack of action, or even an attempt in the right direction, is concerning. He's already aiming to tax pensioners and further burden the citizens. With inflation on the rise and the cost of living crisis showing no signs of abating, the British people are being squeezed from all sides. Meanwhile, Starmer and his cronies seem more concerned with appeasing their base than actually solving the problems facing the country.
Not having enough prison places is about as fundamental a failure as you can get. And those people throwing rocks, torching cars, making threats, they didn't just know the system was broken. They were betting on it, gaming it. They thought, they'll never arrest me. And if they do, I won't be prosecuted. And if I am, I won't get much of a sentence.
In his own words, one of the most glaring failures of the Starmer government is its complete and utter disaster happening with the prison system. Overcrowded, underfunded, and dangerously understaffed, the state of British prisons is a national disgrace. According to the latest figures, the UK's prison population has reached a record high of 88,000 inmates, with many facilities operating at over 130% capacity. And yet, despite these alarming numbers, Starmer's government has done little to address the root causes of this crisis. Nigel Farage is calling out the UK's soft-on-crime policies and has repeatedly called for a complete overhaul of the prison system. And he's absolutely right. When criminals are allowed to roam free because there's no room to keep them locked up, it's the law-abiding citizens who pay the price.
After Barnsley, even I began to think, how am I going to get on? What am I going to do? How do I walk around street markets? What do I do? Well, it turns out that 28-year-old Josh Greeley today has got a suspended sentence and a fine of a massive £85. And I'm sorry, but I think there needs to be some sort of disincentive.
That's an incredibly small punishment for an attempt to attack another person. But it's not just overcrowding or leniency that's the issue. The Starmer government has a unique way to make the problem worse by letting out criminals early. The government has announced emergency measures to deal with prison overcrowding in England and Wales. These include early release for some prisoners when they have served 40% of their sentence. The first people are likely to be released under the scheme in September. But they are punishing one crime, and that's the crime of free speech. Here's how Farage was targeted for simply questioning the details about a criminal.
Record. Is he somebody that the security services were watching? Answer there came none. Then after the riots happened, you've got the whole establishment saying that I encouraged rioting. Well, I mean, all I did was to say, please tell us the truth. Funnily enough, if they had told us the truth, the rioting would not have been anything like as bad as it was, and the authorities need to wake up to an online world. So yes.
Violent riots have been plaguing our nation lately. Any reasonable leader should have put in effort to stop them. But what is Starmer doing? Threatening people not to post riot-related stuff online. They're backing this up with promises of arrest and prosecution. That's a direct attack on your free speech, but it's not all that's on the line here. New reports have hinted at an outdoor smoking ban that's completely against individual liberty.
Suggesting there'll be an outdoor smoking ban. Yeah, that's right. You won't be able to smoke in pub gardens, outside pubs, outside sports venues. Now, of course, this all began really back in 2006 when the Blair government banned indoor smoking, even in private members' clubs. It meant a direct 20% loss of revenue for pubs and working men's clubs, and has been quite a major contributory factor to the closure of 7,000 licensed premises. This particular proposal would, I think, literally kill off the traditional pub for good. They might survive as restaurants, but not as pubs. But Sir Keir seems pretty keen on all of this. Here he was speaking this morning.
Sure, you might think smoking is bad. It definitely is. But people should have the right to choose. Moreover, this has had devastating economic impacts for pubs and the industry in general. What happens when you over-regulate and overtax things? Well, illegal black markets start popping up, and Keir Starmer is definitely taking things in that direction. Farage also pointed out the complete lack of priorities. Should Starmer be worrying about these things when the whole nation is up in flames? Riots, soaring crime rates, illegal immigration, collapsing prison system. But nope, smoking is where the government is focused.
What Starmer doesn't understand, and when he says, I'm going to stop the far right, what he doesn't understand is the general feeling of dissatisfaction that has been out there in this country growing for years. I talked in the general election about societal breakdown. What I meant by that were communities being split apart, people not even recognizing the centers of some of our towns and cities as even being vaguely English anymore.
Farage is right. This blame game is not the solution. People have genuine concerns and a growing feeling of dissatisfaction. As we look at the state of the UK under the Starmer government, it's clear that something needs to change. Whether it's the failure to control immigration, the rising tide of crime, the economic mismanagement, or the crisis in the prison system, the current leadership has shown time and again that it is not up to the task. Nigel Farage, with his willingness to speak the truth, has, time and time again, shut down the government for their horrible policies or downright incompetency. He's not afraid to call out the failures of the Starmer government, and he's not afraid to offer real solutions to the problems we face. So, as we move forward, let's keep demanding more from our leaders. And most importantly, let's keep fighting for the kind of Britain we all want to live in, a Britain that is safe, prosperous, and free from the failures of the past. You can help create such a Britain by liking this video and subscribing to the channel.